Hey folks, it's Katie Phang here on behalf of the Contrarian and on behalf of the Katie Phang News Channel. I wanted to let you guys know that this was an incredibly informative hearing. I'm here live right now in front of the Supreme Court. Just give me 1 second. Alrighty, so I wanted to give you all a little bit of a debrief of what you ended up hearing today. Hold a second. Part of the issues we got going on here, being live in the wild covering this. Alrighty, so court was called into session at 10 a.m. All of the justices obviously were on the bench, and the first person who got up to speak is the person who's the movant, and that was John Sauer. If his name sounds familiar, he is the lawyer that made that outrageous argument, if you'll recall, in the Trump immunity case, that the president could dispatch SEAL Team 6 to go and assassinate a political rival, and that would be within the scope of his presidential ability. Sauer getting up and being questioned and peppered by the justices really wanting to explore with him some very critical issues. Let's focus on what those were so you understand what happened. So, Justice Sotomayor asking John Sauer, what evidence, and this is an important thing, what evidence has ever been presented that Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook did anything in office that would merit her being summarily fired by Donald Trump? Remember, Donald Trump has claimed that she committed mortgage fraud, and he did so by posting it on Truth Social, and he's claiming that that was his notice to her that she was going to either resign or be fired, and that she was fired, right? And Sotomayor is asking, well, what was the immediate harm to the Federal Reserve as an independent agency? Because everybody, including the Trump administration, has conceded that the independence of the Federal Reserve is important. Now, Justice Sotomayor also asking, why is there such a rush to come to the Supreme Court on an emergency application? The Trump administration has lost at the district court level and also has lost at the appellate court level. This is an emergency application to get a stay, meaning the Trump administration wants the Supreme Court to send the case back, right? And in so doing, telling Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook that she cannot continue to serve, because that's been the interesting and unique component here. Governor Cook has continued to serve on the Federal Reserve Board throughout the pendency of this litigation. So Sauer said here, and this was very compelling, not for the administration, he said, we're seeking a stay of an unprecedented preliminary injunction that restored to office a principal officer who had been fired by a president. To which Sotomayor responded, it's unprecedented because of what the president did, not because of what Governor Cook did. So we heard our liberal justices trying to make sure that it was clear that this was coming to the Supreme Court in a manner that has never been done before by a president of the United States. Ketanji Brown Jackson also following on the line of the issue of, well, what evidence is there? She asked John Sauer, what evidence did Trump rely on to make his decision? And she kept on telling John Sauer, don't repeat the allegations that were made by Donald Trump. Show me the evidence. Show me exactly what was the evidence, right? Because usually allegations may be made, but then after that, you would actually have the evidence to support those allegations. Now, in the end, she kept on saying to John Sauer, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, what was presented and what was considered by Donald Trump in order to do his termination of Lisa Cook. And she also challenged John Sauer with saying, the removal order was a Truth Social post. Are you telling us that basically that Trump can post on Truth Social and that constitutes notice in this case? John Sauer taking the most ridiculous position in response. He said, well, you know, Governor Cook, she could have publicly explained on her behalf, but she has failed to do so. which is pretty typical with this administration, this idea that you can make an allegation, not substantiate it with any evidence, and then you want to shift the burden to the person who's the subject of those allegations to have to defend themselves publicly and what? On TV, on social media? Usually it happens in a forum or in a hearing or in a court of law. Told you guys it was old school pen and paper here, right? Justice Samuel Alito asking John Sauer, why would you handle this in such a hurried manner? Remember, there was a preliminary injunction that was entered by the district court judge. It went up on an appeal, and the appeals court sustained the ability for Lisa Cook to continue to serve. But none of the merits have actually been resolved. This emergency application by the Trump administration was to get her off the governor's bench, off that board, excuse me, while the case is pending in its merits, right? And so even Justice Alito said, no court has explored the facts of Governor Cook's removal, and said, are even the documents that Trump claims as evidence of the mortgage fraud, are those even in the record? So even the conservative justices were asking the Trump lawyer, what's going on in terms of the record in this case? Stand by. It's windy, folks. Now, here's where Justice Kavanaugh, again, one of our conservative justices, actually peppered John Sauer with questions about what's the utility in all of this, but in a good way for democracy. I know, it's kind of shocking. Justice Kavanaugh said, if there's no ability for there to be judicial review of a decision by the president, and if there's no remedy that's available based upon a decision by the president, and there's a very low bar created for a, quote, for-cause termination of a governor of the Federal Reserve, and only the president can make these decisions, then doesn't this weaken, if not shatter, the independence of the Federal Reserve? Kavanaugh really pressing John Sauer to explain why there is a broader basic goal to preserve the independence of the Federal Reserve. Kavanaugh furthermore saying this, let's go even farther downstream, Mr. Sauer. Let's talk about the real world effects of a decision that's made by Trump in this way concerning the Federal Reserve. He says, as of January 20th of 2029, and then he caught himself and then he said, or January 20th of 2033, when you have a Democratic president in the Oval Office, isn't it true, Mr. Sauer, that all current governors are pretty much going to be removed? This was assuming that Governor Cook and any other the democratically appointed governors are removed off the board. Justice Kavanaugh is basically saying to John Sauer, come on, don't you agree that effectively a Democratic president is going to remove all current governors? Because then, according to Justice Kavanaugh, it really becomes an at-will removal, meaning this idea that you can only be removed from your job for a cause, meaning for gross negligence or because you committed a crime, etc. It really becomes at-will employment. And Justice Kavanaugh says, once these tools are unleashed, they will be used by both sides, and even more so the second time around. John Sauer responds by saying the president has always had this tool to remove for financial improprieties. And then here's where Sauer let the cat out of the bag. I didn't hear any of the justices pick up on this phrase, but I heard it because I was inside watching these oral arguments in real time. John Sauer said the president always had the tool to remove for financial improprieties committed by Federal Reserve governors who are, quote, credibly accused, end quote. Think about that phrase. Credibly accused. It's got to be credible. And just an apparent allegation or an allegation alone in and of itself is not going to be a credible accusation. Kavanaugh then pressing Sauer even more. In the real world, your position will incentivize presidents to come up with trivial, inconsequential, even old in time, as in before this person takes office, allegations. You just jot them down on a piece of paper and you use them as the excuse to be able to remove somebody from the Federal Reserve. This incentivizes a search and destroy strategy, especially if there's no judicial review and there's no process, you're pretty much done. Sauer then turns this back in Kavanaugh's face and says the following. Well, this court, Trump versus United States, Trump versus Hawaii, has consistently declined to probe the decisions by a president to look into any subjective motivations or reasons, and has given presidents great deference. Makes you kind of wonder if these conservative justices are second guessing the decisions that they made when they basically said that we're not going to probe the pretext and the decision making process behind a president's decisions. We're just going to give him great deference. Kavanaugh then said to Sauer, well, what's the fear of more process here? Why are you so concerned about there being more process? Sauer says, it's our contention that process has occurred. There was a social media post done by Donald Trump on Truth Social notifying Governor Cook as to why she either had to resign or be fired. And there has been months of no clear explanations by Governor Cook. And Kavanaugh said, I don't know the facts of this case, so I'm not going to comment on the facts. Why doesn't he know the facts of this case? Because there are no facts that are part of the record other than Governor Cook explaining that at worst it was an inadvertent mistake for her in the paperwork that dealt with two properties here. Ketanji Brown Jackson, towards the end of the questioning of Sauer, stating, how do you reconcile a president having absolute discretion with the statute that requires him to have for cause to be able to remove a governor? Sauer saying, look, these governors are protected from policy differences because you can only be removed for a cause. Kind of a circular argument. It was about an hour, about an hour's worth of argument with John Sauer, and then Paul Clement, one of the very famous lawyers that has argued here in front of the Supreme Court several times, got up on behalf of Governor Cook, and he said, look, this is basically an at-will employment thing. It does away with this idea that you only have to have for cause to remove a governor, and anything that is, quote, apparent misconduct is sufficient for somebody like Trump. Why abandon 100 years of independence of the Fed on an emergency application here? And look, he said the president himself has discretion to fashion the type of hearing that should take place if you're going to sit there and try to terminate somebody like a Federal Reserve governor. The more process done by Trump, the less room for judicial review afterwards. Clement going on to say, in response to Justice Alito is basically saying, look, if we were to eventually have pre-office leaked videos of a Federal Reserve governor showing appreciation for Hitler or the Ku Klux Klan, don't you think that should be enough to be able to remove that person from the Federal Reserve? And Paul Clement saying, look, these are ridiculous and hard questions because this is an emergency application, because Alito kept imposing more and more absurd and escalating hypotheticals to Paul Clement. Ketanji Brown Jackson underscoring how a lot of the stuff should be decided at the end of a case. The case should not be on an emergency application for a stay by the Trump administration. The case should be decided once a case has been decided on the merits and it makes its way to the Supreme Court. Justice Kagan asking Paul Clement, what would judicial review look like in this case? Clement saying, look, there would be factual questions, and the degree of deference to Trump would depend on the level of process that he provides. The more informal of a process, the more of a review by the judiciary afterwards. And legal questions, you don't get deference to the executive on that. That is just all dealt with upon judicial review. Clarence Thomas asking Paul Clement, who's representing Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, what is this for cause? Are we going to define what for cause means here? Are we going to wait for it? What's going to go on here? Clement responding this way, which I thought was very interesting. He actually called out John Sauer and the Trump administration saying, look, in its briefs, they're calling it apparent mortgage fraud because they can't actually call it mortgage fraud. And because they're calling it apparent mortgage fraud, again, making allegations with no evidence to be able to support it in any credible way, Clement saying that this is an advertisement of the fact that there has been a process failure here by the Trump administration or by Trump. Justice Kavanaugh actually asking Paul Clement, if we find there was insufficient process provided to Governor Cook? Can't we just deny the application for a stay on its face outright and then it gets sent back? And Paul Clement saying, yeah, that's a really simple way to decide this case. And so I thought that was an interesting question by Justice Kavanaugh. Is this a way for us to be able to dispose of this without getting into the weeds about how to define what is for cause removal, et cetera, and what type of hearing process are you supposed to be able to give? Ketanji Brown Jackson then asking Paul Clement, what facts have been established in this? Don't we need the facts to be established before you remove somebody? When were these applications for the mortgages signed? What did she think when she was signing them and attesting to the mortgage applications? Don't we really need to know the facts before you have a situation where somebody gets removed from office? And Clement says, look, normally you'd have all that fleshed out in an evidentiary hearing. And so Ketanji Brown Jackson said, are you also saying that putting out a Truth Social post constitutes notice, sufficient notice? And Clement says, look, I'm actually not even going to contest this idea of the Truth Social post being noticed because it's defective, because the post itself shows that Donald Trump prejudged what he was going to be doing, meaning Trump didn't actually weigh or consider anything concerning Governor Cook, which supports the idea that this was all under pretext, right? This really wasn't a legitimate removal for cause. She didn't really do anything wrong. It's just because there are obviously policy differences. He wants to lower the interest rates, right? There was about an hour of questioning of Paul Clement, and then John Sauer was allowed to get up for a very brief rebuttal. All in, it was about 2 hours plus of these oral arguments. While I was inside the Supreme Court listening to the oral arguments, we actually had a number of Democratic members of Congress that came in front of the Supreme Court to be able to protest the fact that Donald Trump has been summarily exercising what he claims is his broad discretion to be able to remove people like Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. I have a little bit of sound that I want to play for you right now. This is Congresswoman Joyce Beatty explaining why there's very real-world economic implications when you do something like Trump is doing. Take a listen to the sound that we got from Congresswoman Beatty.
So make no mistake, Trump's takeover of the Federal Reserve will negatively affect household finances, financial markets, and threaten Americans' retirement savings, mortgages, and housing costs. We will defend this independent Fed as a fundamental pillar of our economy, and we will fight for Dr. Governor Lisa Cook and Chairman Powell to serve out their term.
I'm glad you heard Congresswoman Beatty reference the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell. We've talked about the attacks on his independence as the Federal Reserve Chair at the Contrarian and at the Katie Phang News Channel. Folks, Jerome Powell came to the oral arguments here at the Supreme Court today, but not just him. Ben Bernanke, he was the Federal Reserve Chair before Janet Yellen, and then after Janet Yellen, it's Jerome Powell. Ben Bernanke was here today as well. What does that tell you about why this case is so important? As you heard the Congresswoman say, and actually as we heard Justice Kavanaugh say, there are very real implications from having a president who is affecting, quote, shattering, according to Justice Kavanaugh, the independence of a Federal Reserve. There was questions today by the justices to both sides about the idea that the market responds to what happens at the Federal Reserve. That when the independence of the Federal Reserve is being questioned in a way, the public loses faith in the ability of the interest rate and for our economy to be affected. It just seems to be like it's going to be at the whims of a president. And as we heard Justice Kavanaugh question John Sauer today, when you unleash this, when you allow other presidents, maybe in a Democratic administration, to be able to do this, don't you run the risk of this being weaponized in some way? It is very important for you to know that we are not going to get an immediate ruling from the court, even though John Sauer said that, quote, Donald Trump has been suffering irreparable harm since Lisa Cook was basically told she could keep her job by the district court and the appellate courts as far back as September of 2025. But we need a ruling from the Supreme Court. I'm happy to say that I thought the questions were thoughtful. The real slippery slope here is this. How do you define and how do you lay out the protocols for a hearing? What do you define as the opportunity for Governor Cook to be heard? Even both liberal and conservative justices today said, is it okay if Donald Trump calls in Governor Cook into the Oval Office, meets with her for an hour, allows her the chance to explain what happened on the mortgage applications, and is that enough? I know it probably doesn't sound like it's enough, but in some ways, because the statute says that there is the ability for the president to be able to do this, it really kind of makes you wonder, should we probe deeper into the rationale and the reasoning behind why the president makes the decisions that he's making, especially when he's the one who gets to decide whether the Federal Reserve governor gets to keep his or her positions. An incredibly important case, as I told you. There's a reason why we at the Contrarian at the Katie Phang News Channel thought it was important for me to be here. I'll have more of a detailed debrief for you later on, but in the meantime, I wanted to come out here and make sure that you understood and that you actually heard some of the lines of questioning that were made today. And again, I want to underscore the fact that we saw Jerome Powell here today. He himself has spoken out about being a political persecution by Donald Trump, who said that he's going after the DOJ, wants to criminally investigate the Federal Reserve for statements made about the renovations of the building. He's spoken out about pretext being used. Jerome Powell has used the word pretext being used by Donald Trump to be able to go after the Federal Reserve. And now we see today that the Supreme Court of the United States is dealing with this idea that's truly pretext and policy differences in terms of the interest rates. And that's the reason why Donald Trump is trying to get rid of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. I'm Katie Phang. Thanks for being here and thanks for joining me right now, and I'll have more information for you later on.